I also don't want to give away too much about like the world in the stream, because I would like, a big part of a West Marches game is to explore it. So I'm kind of in a bind where like I want to stream and talk about it, but I don't want to talk about it too much. But we also have like this time around, players can be DMs and DMs can be players. So how do you keep secrets from each other as the DMs while still managing to come up with new content as you go? So that's going to be a little tricky. All right, let's see what we can do here. I got this old map from the first time we ran it. All right, here we go. All right, so last time we ran this, it took place in the Cursed Valley. The Cursed Valley represents like 1/64th of the size of the procedural world that we were operating out of. And if anybody who's watching has any questions, please just bring it up in chat. I'll try to answer it. Essentially, they sailed across the sea in some ships. The ships got destroyed, and the adventure focused on people who were on one particular ship and where that ship washed up. So, initially, that ship washed up on the shores of this area right here. So let me see. Yeah, so they washed up like right here. Now, they had nothing. They were naked. They didn't have any houses. They barely had any equipment. It was a mess, right? So they had to go and salvage equipment as they explored the area. Now, they met with local crab people who lived down in the water, and they knew that there were monsters up in the forest. They traveled along the beach until they came to a fishkin village. These were murlocs, ripped completely out of Worlds of Warcraft. They fought and killed the murlocs, and the murlocs killed a lot of them, and that is where they decided to, in the huts of the lizard folk, found the town of Goodberry. As a community, the players decided to make the town. They decided what to name the town, and play continued from there. Now, each of us, of the DMs, at that point, was then given a region, right? So I took the east side of the river, okay, and another GM took what was north of Goodberry, and then another GM took what was west of Goodberry. And that's how we divided up the region. So I ran as my core dungeon, right? Because each of the areas had a core dungeon. So the west had Forge of Fury. The north had Sunless Citadel, which later became a town. And then the east had Cult of the Reptile God, which is a first edition adventure about Explicta Defilis. Matt Koval's a big fan of that one. So, our different dungeons interacted with the town in different ways. Okay, so Dwargar from the Forge of Fury would constantly hunt this area. So this DM focused more on hex crawling. So as they explored and mapped and charted out this area doing hex crawling, which was just a series of random encounters, some of them deadly, some of them easy, some of them profitable, some of them a waste of time. That's just hex crawling. He added to his random encounter chart heck amounts of monsters that were coming to the surface from the Forge of Fury to also hunt and explore. Okay, so that was how that dungeon interacted with the world. Now, more so, to the very west, there is a Dwarf Settlement, way off map. The Dwarves wanted to reclaim the Forge of Fury, so they would send, occasionally, Dwarves to say, try to find the Forge of Fury. So he added to his random encounter table some random dwarf adventures that you could run into while you were out and about. Okay. So Dwargar, dwarves, Favelden, mercenaries, that sort of thing got added as a result of the Hellhole being here. Alright, so North of Goodberry, there was the ruins of the Sunless Citadel, which used to be an Aldfair fortress, blah, blah, blah. So the DM for that setting, he had a guy named King, which is a big old monkey, and he's a giant ape with a bunch of other apes that work for him. He was corrupted by the magic fruit that grows in this dungeon. And the idea was the longer this dungeon went unconquered, the more corrupted animals would show up in the region as they got poisoned by the corrupted fruit, growing in the unholy grove in the center of the Sunless Citadel. If you haven't played any of these adventures, I'm spoiling all of them for you. So I took the eastern side of the river, and I had the Cult of the Reptile God. Now, the Cult of the Reptile God is a pod person adventure. So they were constantly sending minions over to steal citizens. So you're trying to build a town and your citizens go missing. It's kind of a big deal. Sometimes the citizens would show back up after they had been brainwashed, hence the pod person thing. That was more dangerous because then they would bring more people with them back to the dungeon who would get brainwashed, and slowly but surely the population was being brainwashed into followers of Explictidophilis, a powerful guardian Naga. So the people that lived in the town, the PCs and the NPCs, they're in a fuck you sandwich, right? Three layer fuck you sandwich. So they're dealing with 3 different dungeons, and each of the dungeons is impacting the region in a different way. So there was an obligation there that they needed to go and deal with each of these dungeons, and hence they each had 3 characters in some cases to play with each of the 3 DMs. Eventually, we had so many players that you couldn't do something like that because you only had one group exploring a dungeon at a time. Sometimes I would instance a dungeon, World of Warcraft style, so 2 different groups could go through the same dungeon. That worked out pretty well. It's really just about how you want to handle it. When I was instancing my dungeon, I still made it that major boss and final bosses could only be killed by the first group that got there. So if I did allow an instance run of a dungeon, it was the same, except once the boss was killed, the final boss was killed, you couldn't do that dungeon anymore in that way, because at that point you could explore the dungeon, and every time they destroyed a dungeon, they turned it into a settlement. So the Forge of Fury became a Dunduran outpost. They had a wild surge that created a town on top of the Citadel. So they built Warrensville. And then the Iron Ring was founded in Explictidophilis' caves and became like a mining colony. So that's how the DMs used to handle it. And what I'm describing right there pretty much encompassed like almost 2 years of gameplay. Other stuff happened. I got permission from the North Region Dungeon Master to take these hexes and place the ruins of an ancient mage tower sunken underground. So I ran the 4th edition adventure, The Lost Library. And so my peeps traveled up the river. There we go. Yeah, so they left Goodberry, they traveled upriver, and then they went on the adventure in this zone. But I did ask the DM who owned those hexes if I could put a dungeon there. We did an event dungeon for Extra Life north of Warrensville. Okay, so that was a fun thing that we did. So as a group of DMs, we agreed that we would put the Extra Life dungeon right there, which eventually got sucked into another dimension and left a big crater. Over here, you could see Wyvern Rock. This is the first time they killed a big monster so well and so awesomely that they were losing their minds with joy about it. So they wanted to add Wyvern Rock to the map. So Wyvern Rock became a special place. From there, they were able to find a swamp. The swamp was full of kobolds. After killing the wyvern, they subjugated the kobolds, and then the kobolds became playable race in the game. Now, way up here, we did another Extra Life Marathon adventure in this region right here. And we picked a couple of hexes and we said this is where the Extra Life Marathon is going to be for that. So the idea is the map has hexes laid over it. This one does not, because this was a player version of the map. But the DMs are basically given hexes to work with. And it's like, put whatever you want in these hexes, but you know, you could either do it procedurally or you could just decide this is what's in the hexes. If you want to honor the old ways, you'll use like a hex crawl generator, and it'll tell you like what's in that hex, how dangerous it is, all that kind of stuff. We had a system in place. We made our own table to roll on, which would determine like if there's anything interesting in a hex and all that kind of stuff. But nowadays, I'm pretty sure there's a hex crawl generator that you could just generate what's in a hex. Hexes are pretty big. I think a hex is like 24 miles across or something, so it equates to several hundred square miles of area that has to be explored. So exploring a hex can take a long time. So hex crawling is a type of thing that you can do in the Paradise Vale West Marches. You can have them hex crawl. When they're exploring a hex, they'll either discover resources and or local monsters and or indigenous people and or a dungeon. So those are the different things that they can find in a hex. If they find a dungeon, now you can start having sessions where they go to explore that dungeon. Since you will know how many hexes you have and where those hexes are at the beginning of the game, or at least when you sign on to be a DM, you can start seeding through roleplay on the Discord through NPCs and billets and quests and things like that, that you want this region explored, that you've heard rumors of ancient ruins, whatever you need to do to get people to explore your hexes. So that's the idea. A GM for Paradise Vale is assigned a small amount of hexes, right? And what they do with those hexes is pretty much their business, but they're trying to get people to leave the central hub and go to their hexes and explore them. If there's dungeons there, delve them, that kind of thing. We're going to encourage DMs to only focus on one dungeon at a time. So you get like a cluster of hexes, and on one of those hexes, you could put the entrance to a dungeon. Now, the dungeon could be a dungeon that you made up yourself, or it could be a store-bought one that you got off of like, Drive-Thru or DM's Guild, or it could be something from DM Dave, whatever. If you are running a published adventure and you haven't heavily modified it, you should put it out there that you are running that module so that you don't get people signing up for your adventure that have already DM'd it or already done it. So that's important. So we will keep a list of adventures that have already been run so that we don't get duplicates. But you're not discouraged from using store-bought content to fill out your hexes. So that's basically how that works. And this map with crayons drawing all over it succinctly explains all that perfectly, I guess. Cool. Alright, so things to keep in mind when you're running Paradise Vale is that for flavor reasons, there's no humans. Okay? All of the humans, they don't use the word human, they don't say humankind, they don't say humanoids. Well, maybe they say humanoids, but they try to avoid it. Valorians are Valorians. They don't know what a human being is. Nobody ever came up with that term. So they are humans by our standards. And they are tenacious and greedy and emotional and potentially very powerful and potentially very stupid. They are everything that a human being is, especially in Fantasyland. Any class, any level, #2E kind of thing. Like they're people. But we call them Valorians. We don't use the term human to help with the immersion that the Valorians are their own people, right? They do their own thing. On that same note, the dwarves do not like to be called dwarves because a dwarf is a short, malformed person, maybe people would say, right? So they consider themselves who they are, which is the Dundurin. Like they didn't decide like, we're pretty short and stocky. Let's call ourselves dwarves. They are the Dundurin. That's what they call themselves. Now, their cousins, the Tippler dwarves, they're a mess. So they think it's funny to call themselves dwarves. They spend most of the time drunk, that kind of thing. But these guys consider it pretty racist, pretty impolite to call them dwarves. They are the Dundurin. They have their own history for thousands of years, blah, blah, blah. They don't want to be called dwarves. On that note, there's no Aldfair, which is to say elves, because when the Dundurin and the Aldfair went to war, the Dundurin pretty much wiped them out. So the Aldfair are the elves. There are still drow. Drow live underground. That is where some of the Aldfair went when their culture was shattered. Like they dispersed to different places. So some Aldfair became sea elves by migrating to the oceans. Some went underground and became drow. There's splinter cells basically that split off from the main race when their culture was destroyed by the Dundurin. So there are no elves. Elf is a term that people use, but sort of like dwarf, it's considered very impolite, very crass to use it. The Faveld are the pure-blooded ancestors of Aldfair and orcs. So they're half orc, half elves that created their own pure bloodline. So they are violent, but also beautiful, combining like elf and orc into one race. There are no orcs in the setting. So if an adventure calls for orcs, you're going to need to swap it out with something else. So it's little things like that you just need to make adaptations to when you want to run an adventure. And we'll have like a list for GMs that kind of runs you through like the do's and don'ts of making it match for the setting. Sort of like, running a dungeon is cool. Running a dungeon that could result in the destruction of the whole world, probably not cool, because we're all playing in the world. We don't need the whole world destroyed. Now, there could certainly be consequences of an adventure failing, and they could certainly impact other regions that other DMs are controlling, and all of that is sort of communicated by the GMs. There'll be a GM channel just for Paradiseville, where only people who are tagged as GMs can go in and talk about it. So even then, you may want to mark your stuff with spoilers, just so that people that might be other GMs that are in your game don't get spoiled on the adventures that you're running. So it's going to be tricky to allow people to be DMs and players at the same time. GMs are more than likely going to run into some spoilers at some point and just going to have to, play around them. So that is how DMs are going to divide up the world. The other feature of the West Marches this time around is that there is going to be underneath the Outpost, which is the central hub of the campaign. The Outpost is an ancient Aldfair ruin. And the settlement is built in basically like a corner of that massive fortress that has been destroyed and sunk beneath the earth. Dundurin magic, blah, blah, blah. So one of the go-to, I don't know what to run options you have, if you don't just feel like doing random, hex crawling or random patrols or whatever, is you could do a delve. And basically, the dungeons beneath, the caverns and dungeons and caves, tunnel systems beneath the Outpost are effused with wild magic from when the Aldfair and the Dundurin went to war. So every time you go dungeon delving down there, it's different. It's very like meta, very video gamey. But essentially, anytime a group goes down there, the dungeon's going to be different. So you could use a random dungeon generator, you could use a 3-room dungeon, you could grab a hold of like the book I shared on Discord that has like 83 different 5-room dungeons. But the idea is that every time you go down there, the dungeon changes. It's the magic that was left over from the war. It created a region where like the doorway to the underground could lead anywhere. It could lead to any dungeon in any world, essentially. It could just lead to some crazy like 3-room dungeon where every room is just full of goblins from floor to ceiling. Whatever nonsense you want to do. It could be a funhouse dungeon, it could be a meat grinder dungeon, it could be a dungeon full of interesting lore and plot. Whatever you need it to be. So running a delve is basically easy mode creatively, right? So you don't have to worry about your region, you don't have to worry about running exploration, you don't have to worry about any of that kind of stuff. You just worry about going down and fighting some monsters in the dungeon. That's it. So the delve is going to be like that, which will be pretty cool. So what else? There's going to be a list of all the adventures that we've already run in the previous generation of the world to avoid. There's going to be the delve. There's going to be the hexes. Yeah, I mean, I can't really think of any other questions a DM might have for this. I'm sure there are. I mean, is anybody in chat like interested in DMing in this or wondering how DMs are going to handle this? Nope. Okay, cool. All right. Well, that was pretty much what I wanted to talk about on stream, was how that was going to go down. How is XP handled for GMs? So I'm thinking GMs would receive half of the XP that was handed out on their adventure, and adventures are going to hand out XP in bundles, if that makes sense. So basically, when you hand out XP in bundles, it's like a halfway point between a milestone and an actual XP-based game. So in Darker Dungeons, you earn XP for all the gold you bring back. So you're going to need to keep that in mind when you're handing out gold, because any gold that gets brought back gives you experience points. And you could give out XP based on fighting and killing monsters, and that definitely plays a part in it. But when you give every single creature its own individual XP value, that's where you start to get into like the more murder hobo situations. So tying the XP to gold and quest goals is better. So if you're hired to scout a hex, you get XP for scouting the hex, not for the monsters that you killed in the hex. If you get hired to take out the albino chimera, then you get XP for killing the albino chimera. You don't get XP for the village of Kuotoa who worship the albino chimera. But if those Kuotoa did have a bunch of gold on them, you would get XP for that. So that's how we're handling XP for players. And then GMs essentially would receive, I'm thinking like half of whatever the active players in the adventure receive. Keeping in mind that you can't just be handing out hell amounts of XP so that you could 50% rate XP level your own people up, because that would be kind of shitty. Yeah. All right. I'm trying to find. I guess it's the same document, but I had a newer document I thought that had all of the stuff from the upcoming game in one place. But I'm looking through here and I'm not seeing it. So maybe Wes made it. Maybe I gotta look through that. Hold on a sec. Okay. Maybe it was this document. I mean, it says PVDMs, but it also has a whole bunch of stuff from our other, the previous generation. Okay, here we go. So it talks about the world map. Hexes have been scaled down, but are still huge. A hex is 20 miles across, which yields a square mileage of 344 square miles. So 344 square miles is a lot of miles. How many GMs do I have so far? Officially, there are 2. There's me and Wesley. There have been a lot of people who are interested in signing up for it, and that's cool. But I need to sort of get it to a point where I could explain very easily, like, this is what it entails, kind of thing, which is, I guess, what I'm trying to brainstorm out right now. I was kind of just like, yeah, it'd be cool if there were other DMs, and then I didn't really think about it again, because I was thinking about, like, getting everything ready to go, like making sure that the houses were set up and all that kind of thing. Sometimes I like collaboratively coming up with things, and sometimes I am in a hurry to get things done, and I feel like the less cooks that are in the kitchen, the better. So for things like rapid fire knocking out as much design as possible, I really just wanted to keep the number of people doing that work low. Like, I get it, it's super fun to, like, design worlds or whatever, but when you have so many people involved in a creative project, it can get bloated and it can go in, like, a million different conflicting directions. So I would much rather have a more uniform and focused design for a small central hub, and then empower each of the DMs within those confines and constraints to build out whatever story or narrative or direction they're trying to go in. I don't want any of the GMs to feel like they have to tell the next greatest story that's ever been told. Again, if you just wanted to pick up like an adventure path or a couple of dungeon crawls and run those, that would be just as useful as trying to write some amazing narrative. Honestly, with the West Marches game, if you do have an ongoing narrative, it's generally based around your central dungeon. So my narrative was Explicted Dephilus is pod peopling all of the townsfolk. Wesley's thing was the evil druidess that lived at the bottom of the Sunless Citadel was planting these vampire fruits everywhere, corrupting all the animals. You got to stop her. It's corrupting all the animals and the goblins and the kobolds and all that jazz. And then Connor, who ran Forge of Fury, unfortunately he had to stop, and I had to take over that adventure path and finish it. That was very much like the Faveld and the evil dwarves are basically trying to awaken what lives at the bottom of the Forge of Fury and use its power for themselves to subjugate the surface world, blah, 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 blah. And honestly, a lot of it's organic, because later when we ran the Gates of Firestorm Peak for Extra Life, we had those same the same evil dwarves from the Forge of Fury. The ones that were in the Forge of Fury were actually a smaller group that were part of the settlement outside of the Gates of Firestorm Peak. So we sort of tied everything together. Yeah. Now, how are we going to determine DMs? Are we going to just let anybody run a game? Gosh, it's going to be pretty rough, but I think we're going to need to like have like quality assurance. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm going to just ask people, like, after they're done with like a new GM, like, I'll probably send them a flippin' survey. You know, I'll be like, how did you feel about this game? How did you feel about the DM? How was the DM's knowledge of the rules? How did the DM, handle themselves in that situation? Like, all that jazz. At the same time, I'm also going to follow up with people about players. If there's players that are hard to group with, hard to deal with, they, we want to know about it, because if there are problem people on the server, or problem people in the West Marches, we need to be aware of it. So it's one of those things that, like, because it's a community-based game, like how you act and how you manage your games and how you manage yourself as a player is going to have weight and consequences. So more than likely, anybody is welcome to try and run a game. I think everyone will have to run a delve before they're given a region. So let me write that down. That's a good idea. All right, every new GM, one delve before receiving any hexes to populate. Okay, that's pretty cool. Let's see. In your hex region, you will only need one major dungeon and or one indigenous settlement. All right, cool. Yeah. Now, if I was taking seriously every person that said they wanted to be a GM, I think I've heard from 5 people. So that would put us at 7 GMs for this, which would be pretty amazing. It'd be pretty amazing. That being said, there is going to be like a paywall of like $5 per session for players, so that may dissuade some people from playing, because there are people that still, even with all the work that goes into running a virtual tabletop game and the expense of supporting creators to get maps and all that other kind of stuff, don't think that they should have to pay to play D&D. So, I mean, cool story. But that's not what I think, and that's not what I support. So, also, I find that if you have even put down such a small amount of money as $5 for a session, you are less likely to cancel on that session or not show up for that session. Because believe it or not, people, especially Americans, are crazy about losing money. So they will show up so that they don't lose that $5 whole, which is kind of crazy. Generally, when games are run for free, it doesn't seem to matter how great the DM is. People will not perceive it as being as valuable, and you will have people show up late, you'll have people cancel last minute, all that jazz. So this particular system is very deadly. It's going to take a lot of work by the DMs to balance things. So if you have players dropping or not showing up, it's going to require a lot of balancing on the fly in what is already a pretty difficult rule set to run and manage. So that's part of why we're having that paywall there. So, yeah. That is another thing, is there's going to be some temptation, obviously, to do resource sharing. But we're not going to be doing any resource sharing. So, while it would be great to have all of the regions forests look exactly the same, you're pretty much responsible for your own assets for your region and your adventures. So we're not going to have some huge Google Drive or Dropbox where everybody drops all their stuff, and as a big community we like mutually pirate all of the maps on the internet. So everybody is still responsible for maintaining their own collection of paid resources. If you have free resources, or if you make custom stuff in Incarnate or whatever, you can totally share that out. We can make such a drive, such a cloud storage thing for things that are Creative Commons or have been released publicly. But the temptation I've seen with West Marches is definitely everybody shares everything. We're not going to do that. So, going back to this world map thing, this world map section, it talks about hexes and what the hexes mean. Technically, all the hexes are labeled. What I mean by that is this is the whole world as procedurally generated. This area right here, oh, I think I opened the wrong one. Yeah, whatever. This area right here that is circled is the original area. And I don't know if I can zoom in close enough for you to see, but in this area, there we go. Each of these hexes was given like a label, and then that label was in a Google document that all the GMs had access to, so they knew what each of those hexes had going on in it. So we used our random hex tables to essentially populate these hexes with content, and then everybody knew what everybody else's hex had. The reason for that is you would know if your adventurers were trying to go into another person's hex, you could always message them and be like, hey, it looks like my party might cross over into your region. Is it cool if I run hex D6, D6D or whatever? And then they're like, oh yeah, D6D, I didn't really have anything planned for it. There's a Tyrannosaurus Rex on the loose, but other than that, that's all I got for it. And then you go back and you're like, sweet, they're all going to die to a Tyrannosaurus Rex. So, but that's why we had them all labeled out like that. So, the idea is there would be a document where you would look up D6, and D6 would have feral elves, sea dragons. Yeah. So the GMs, a GM runs a game. You need to have at least 3 players, and you can have no more than 6 players, unless we have agreed to do like a raid or something like that, which is a thing that you could do with West Marches games. So basically 3 to 6 players, and you collect $5 from each player. If you are DMing and you do not feel comfortable taking money for DMing, you still take the money. If you don't want to use it, we'll put it towards boosting the server or buying assets for DMs who don't have a lot of money, so that they can have some nice virtual tabletop assets to work with. The money will be invested back into the project. But I guess if you feel really terrible about it, you don't want to receive money for DMing, you don't have to do it. Or you could just realize that you have skills that are being compensated and take your $15 to $30 or whatever and buy yourself a pizza. Because honestly, $15 to $30 for 3 to 5 hours of active work, not to mention how much time you put into prepping it. I mean, I know that you're enjoying yourself, but you should still be compensated for the work that you're doing. So, but yeah, the GMs are going to get paid if they want to, and if they don't want to, the money will be put towards making the whole project better overall. So, because if you're running on Foundry, you're going to have to probably pay for a server, either a server that you maintain yourself or a server that you rent from Amazon, plus any number of Patreons that you support. There's a lot of fees when it comes to DMing, so especially with virtual tabletop. All right, let's see. So the alphanumeric grid is overlaid to quickly designate locations on a map. Let's see. We had rules back in the day for how many NPCs needed food and what you could do to generate food. We went crazy with this thing. So it was full civilizations. We had a system here for how many units you needed to have a unit of iron and what iron could be used for. Advanced resources. We had rules for surveying a hex. A forest hex takes 3 weeks of in-game time to survey for resources. One team of 5 with at least one person trained in survival would take 3 weeks. So 3 teams could share the work and reduce it to 1 week. If a druid or ranger is present, you double that team's efforts. If no one has survival or the hex is cursed, which was a thing that could happen, roll a death save for each person. If they fail, they die attempting the survey. So this is basically sending out NPCs that you that are in your employ to survey hexes for you. Maybe you decide that hex crawling is the pits, so you would go and essentially hire NPCs to do the hex crawling and be like, tell me when you find a dungeon. I mean, that's the thing you could do. So, and then all of these things can stack positively or negatively to impact the cost and time it takes to survey a hex on the hex crawl. So 10 acres would take a week. 1 square mile is 500 acres. I mean, we did all this kind of crazy math to mess with this thing. And we have a document called Explored Hexes, or we did. It's also full of resources too. Let's see. I think this document has all sorts of information. Oh, yeah. So it had... Yeah, it had all these different NPCs and what they were up to and what their jobs were and what you could hire them to do, how old they were, if you could marry them or not, like if they were in a relationship, if they had any children. All this stuff was like mapped out. It was crazy. And then there were the active PCs, including all of the PCs that died, which was a lot. A lot of PCs died. It was pretty rough. And then we kept track of players, and then we had something to track hexes. So each hex has an alpha that lives there. So it's either a group of monsters or a solo monster that is the boss of that hex. So while we were sort of randomizing these hexes, you can see that we determined what the alpha creature was, special notes that might be needed, where in the world it is. So these are all in the Cursed Valley. The type of hex that it was, a forest, a coastal forest, a forest coastal river. If it was dangerous, rich, so on and so forth, and then how many resources could be obtained from that hex. So wood, stone, fiber, iron, copper, gold, minerals, salt, and residuum could all be found in these different things. So it was pretty cool. And yeah, like you can see here, B13, the alpha was the Reptile God. So it was, here were notes about it. It was a forest river hex. It was a dangerous hex. So a dangerous hex, you're more likely to have random encounters, and those random encounters are more likely to be dangerous. A rich hex is more likely to have, there was Monster Hunter monsters for days. Monster Hunter monsters for days. A hex is considered safe when the alpha for the hex is killed. The players magically know that the alpha has been killed. So when they kill the alpha for a hex, they know about it. Like they know, hey, we killed the alpha for the hex. Killing an alpha on a hex will net renown, even if you were not on a quest to do so. So that's pretty cool. What else? Here, the Reptile God, not only does it have iron, but there was already a mine built in there. So that's kind of cool. But yeah, like, it was really fun. It was really fun. Let's see. Is there any other information that's on here? We started trying to build our own crafting system rules, but ultimately we just purchased some crafting system rules because often, like, time is more valuable than being creative. So we just, did that. There was an injuries table where we would track ongoing injuries. This was so that if Ed White shattered his hip in Wesley's game, he couldn't try and go to some other DM's game with a shattered hip because we just look up his injuries and be like, it says here you got a shattered hip. You're supposed to be in bed for another 6 weeks. And then that character has to stay in bed for another 6 weeks. We're not going to use Hammond's. We're going to use Anna's or whatever. I feel like she did a better job. She did a more interesting, thorough job. Hammond's is sort of like all over the place as far as like, I don't know. Hammond's is good, but I feel like this other one is better. So we're going to use the one that Anna came up with. Yeah. So, let's see. If you already have Hammond's, I guess you could just use Hammond's rather than purchasing a whole nother set. Yeah. Let's see. looting monsters is obviously going to be very important because there's not a lot of magic items in this. Magic items are limited essentially to one magic item per dungeon. So if you're running a published adventure, and that published adventure is chalkers with magic items, you have to decide which one of those magic items is going to stay, and then everything would just be replaced with gold or the gold equivalent. But gold is also very limited in this, so you're going to have to check with the Darker Dungeons book and make sure that you lower the gold that is found to be in line with the rules. So but yeah, like this, every time we got new injuries, we'd go to this chart and we'd add the injury on there. We'd say who it happened to. We'd say what they needed to do to get over that injury before they could start adventuring again. Chaz Chapman, for example, a wild surge turned his tongue into a hard piece of leather. So that caused him to screw up spells with verbal components. So in order to alleviate that, he had to drink poisonous softeners and leather treating chemicals once a week to keep his leather tongue soft. How many players have I had join the new West Marches? Probably less than I've had GMs sign up, which is no surprise because these rules are insanely hard and terrible. But I guess as long as there's 3 players, they could just play with everybody who wants to DM. I mean, as it's more established, I'll share it out more, like before and after streams and before and after games, to let people know that they're welcome to come sign up and play. And if we're streaming the games, obviously people will see what it's all about and all that jazz. But it's definitely going to take a special kind of player to want to do this, because this is a crunchy game. I mean, bad things happen to you. You don't get a lot of rewards for it. The biggest reward is being the first person to explore something and name something and essentially shape the history of an imaginary world. Like, this isn't like Forgotten Realms, where they've been around for 40,000 years and everybody has already named everything and every dungeon was a dungeon already, and your dad went to that dungeon when he was a kid and he did all the cool shit, and now you're just dealing with the 15th generation of monsters that's taken up residence in that dungeon. This is very much like, the players named everything. That's another thing about this setting. Like, if they're going up against Kuatoa, you never tell them that they're Kuatoa. Like, the players are explorers in a strange new land. They can name the monsters whatever the hell they want. They want to name the monsters like goldfish dudes, and they all agree that those are named goldfish dudes. That's what we call them. They're no longer Kuatoa, they're goldfish dudes. Our players, they found a T-Rex. They didn't know what a dinosaur was. They didn't know what a T-Rex was. They didn't know what an alligator was, so they called it a gigadile. And everyone just called T-Rex a gigadile from that point on. And honestly, that was the kind of flavor that made you feel like you were in a world that you were making and that you were contributing to make, and not just the 10,000th person to play this Forgotten Realms Wizards of the Coast module. So that's sort of the big appeal there. So, let's see. So we also tracked resources for settlements, which was kind of interesting as well, like how many each settlement had, all that kind of stuff. There is also a calendar, and the calendar keeps track of building projects and how long those projects are going to take to finish building. And the calendar, for simplicity's sake, it just is our normal real-world calendar to make it easier to keep track of. Time, however, time is tracked and progresses constantly. So this facilitates the continuing growth of civilization, adds realism and immersion to the gameplay, as well as weight to the player's decisions and actions. Any day that passes in the real world that does not have a scheduled active game happening in it counts as 2 days in Paradise Vale. So time is very wibbly wobbly. Any day that has an active session scheduled passes it a 1-to-1 rate. These numbers may change over time, playtesting, blah blah blah. Sometimes a party will begin adventure in one session but require more than one session to complete it. In these cases, the PCs are considered to be in a separate instance of time. Once they complete their mission quest and return to the settlement or safe, stable location, they are reinserted into the main timeline of the world as fluidly as possible. So if a group was on an adventure, and by the time they returned from the adventure, they were only on the adventure for 3 days. But while they were away on the adventure, the actual timeline of the world advanced 3 weeks. They would be reinserted into the timeline 3 days after they left for the dungeon, and then they would instantly have 2 weeks and 4 days worth of downtime that they could cash in. So if they needed to level up, their characters wouldn't actually have to wait that long because they already had accrued downtime because the rest of the world continued on without them. So that's what we did to manage time with so many different groups and still account for downtime and stuff like that. Occasionally, the GMs and players will vote for a time skip, and this will essentially speed up time or just jump ahead a certain number of weeks or a certain number of months or even like a year to see, hey, what happens now kind of thing. So, and then we had this in-game calendar, and the in-game calendar sort of tracked what was going on in the world. And then there was different notes and stuff that would happen. I think this was towards the end. So yeah, there's previous years. Let's see if it'll load. There we go. So we got the second battle of winter, the journey to the king. Yeah, so there was like a lot of cool stuff that happened. Not everybody was as studious about recording stuff as others. We did have one player that was like just bananas over the setting, and he actually wrote a historical document that's on the website of everything that had happened, which was pretty cool. So this is from when they first left Old Valoria until they ended the campaign, as it were. So this covers everything from developing chocobo racing to discovering like an unusual corpse that led to like a murder mystery, meeting the Fireclaw kobolds for the first time, when the Mages Guild and the Thieves Guild went to war against each other and there was like a riot, declining birth rates and having to solve that issue. Yeah, when pugs were discovered, there was a wild surge that created pugs, so now they have pugs. Yeah, it was really, really cool. So, and then notable NPCs and PCs were also in this document, which was pretty cool. And it sort of talked about these people. Some of them were NPCs and some of them were PCs, but they were people that were so influential on the world that everybody... yeah, this is taking place 20 years after all the events in this document, and in a different region. So the people in the region are from this region, and they would know this history. But all this happened 20 years before what we're doing now. So, but even like Explicta Dephilus made it in there. So it was pretty neat because they teamed up with like a Krokin ninja. She's an evil and ancient spirit that plagued the land of Krokin for decades before being driven out. Not satisfied to let such a powerful evil loose in the world, a team of Krokin ninja tracked her with hopes of killing her. Meanwhile, Dephilus set herself up as a goddess for some troglodytes in the sunken Dunduran ruins. With a taste for mousekin flesh and slaves, she became a true threat to the continued existence of Goodberry, using poisons, mind control, and sleeper agents to slowly dismantle the town. Alas, heroes came and ended her long life in a very definitive way. And then there was the dragon that they had to kill, and the dragon was so tough that they had to send 12 people, so we did like a raid to kill this dragon, which was awesome. So yeah, it was really cool, and it was like pretty early on in roll 5e and roll 20, so it was very exciting to like have dynamic lighting and all this other kind of stuff. At the time, we were just, I don't know, we were all crazy about it. Yeah. And then there's a more expanded history. When they first left their homeland, things that happened on the boat, when they got wrecked, when they first met the mousekin that they adopted, when they went to kill the fishkin, aka the murlocs. Yeah, it was great. It was a really good time. So hopefully we can kind of recreate some of that with this new telling, I guess, of the game.